I have the privilege this morning of introducing our next general speaker, and it is Mr. Comer Yates. I was a teacher in Memphis, Tennessee, working with children for dyslexia, and I knew of Comer's work in the Atlanta Speech School. And it wasn't until I moved here, which was just in December, that I officially got to meet him. So it is my great privilege to introduce him as our first general speaker who's going to talk about, now we're going to get into the meat, the content, the heart of why we're here together for these next 2 days. He's going to focus on exploring the root causes, because until we know the root causes, we will continue to do what I call Band-Aid fixes. So that is where we are going to start our summit. Mr. Comer Yates has served for 20 years as the executive director of the Atlanta Speech School, the nation's most comprehensive language and literacy center with 4 schools, 5 clinics, and the Rollins Center for Language and Literacy. Through research-based language and literacy instruction and intervention, the school impacts the lives of approximately 1,400 children and adults on its campus and thousands of students across Georgia and the nation through the Rollins Center Professional Development Program and its free online Cox campus. And if you're not familiar with it, I highly suggest that you go to their website and view it. The center also coaches teachers on how to break the cycle of illiteracy and resulting poverty for children from families caught in generational lack of access to educational opportunity. Mr. Yates serves as chair of the Georgia Commission on Hearing Impaired and Deaf Persons. He also serves as the co-chair of Georgia's Pathway to Language and Literacy, is on the cabinet of Get Georgia Reading, and is a member of the Georgia Department of Public Health's Brain Trust for Babies. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Comer Yates.
Good morning, y'all. I think I'll take over Malcolm's podium. I won't do it the same justice as Malcolm. Teresa, I'm really grateful for the invitation you offered me to be here today. And oftentimes when somebody makes a presentation, the person will use the word privilege around saying, privileged to be here, and then we're on to the topic. I want to stop for a moment, though, and really speak to the privilege of being here at the Sandra Dunnigan Deal Center. I have the greatest respect, as I'm sure all of you do, regard, admiration for Mrs. Deal and Governor Deal on so many different levels, who have committed themselves more unconditionally, more courageously to each of our children in our state than any other governor and first spouse in the country. And I think we all owe them our same devotion to this effort. They have 6 months left in office, just 6 months. And I would urge, and I think about this occasion, and being given the honor of speaking at an organization named for Mrs. Deal, what can I say today to do justice to their efforts? How can I help make a difference in these next 6 months so that when they leave, that their stewardship has not just been great, but collectively, to quote Malcolm, we've made it our best, that we've given our best in response to their best. And it makes me think about being at a conference 2 years ago where Mrs. Deal stood up and implored the group around the devastating crisis of illiteracy in which we see our children. And it was clear, at least figuratively, and I think literally, that Ms. Deal is going to be reading to a pre-K class somewhere, at some hour on the last day that they're in office. You know, some people may be dragged out of the governor's mansion or the White House. She's going to be dragged out of a pre-K classroom reading with children. And she got up and made that plea for help and commitment. And then Caitlin Dooley got up and offered us a very clear image of what classrooms sound like that are healthy classrooms and look like for children who are developing language and literacy skills. And it was incredibly inspiring that Ami Klin got up and gave the research on what we can do for each child now. And then I'll just be honest with you, a couple hours later, another public official in our state got up and said, oh, wait a minute. We all know that real change in literacy outcomes can't happen in an election cycle. And then she delivered those cruel words to our children we hear over and over again once people get too excited about change, and said, and of course there's no silver bullet. Well, in my mind, government is deal are our silver bullet. And we dishonor them when we don't think we can make immediate change. You heard Malcolm talk about change can be fast. And in my mind, that person who is speaking doesn't know the science, is impervious to what we've done to our children. And maybe in the context, to make it clear, and regardless of whatever you think is happening in another part of the country, the truth of the science is that we have constructed cages of illiteracy for our children. We have inflicted, it's not what they have failed to do. We have failed them by containing their lives, not giving them the chance to be the best, because we have not given them literacy and not given them access to their voices. So if you see this first slide, everything we think about in our work at the speech school is around this one truth said by Frederick Douglass 150 years ago, whose slave owner became furious when he found out that his wife was teaching Frederick Douglass to read, exploded at her, because he realized the danger that was involved in Frederick Douglass having the power of words. As Douglass said, once I knew those words, those fleeting thoughts that I'd had that would disappear in my brain, but suddenly became a call to action to try to change the world. And his slave owner knew that and would try to do anything he possibly could to keep him from it. People didn't want slaves to learn how to write because they could write passes to get them through bounty hunters' guarded stations to be able to travel north. It was literally about freedom. So for us at the speech school, when we think about best meaning to be able to have a voice. To read means that a person can decide his own future and make the greatest difference possible in the lives of others. Have you heard somebody who can read recently and who has a voice talk about and make it a difference for other people? It was about 10 minutes ago, I think, if I remember, 15 minutes ago, while we got lost back there in the bathrooms. But anyway, so this idea of being your best was recently revealed in a different way at Stanford's graduation by one of its graduates, Sterling Brown, who is a famous actor, who at this year's commencement at Stanford described the power of a voice. So if we can just play that, Bradley. If we can go back, yeah.
You have an opportunity, a responsibility to leave this world better than how you found it. And you do that by being brilliant, by letting your light shine. And don't worry about anybody else's light. Don't try to compare yours to anyone else's. If you have found that thing, that purpose in life that gives you access to maximum enthusiasm, trust that. I'm not talking about a job. I'm not even talking about a career. I'm talking about a calling. Class of 2018, no one is an island unto themselves. We have all benefited from and been supported by the communities which have nourished us along the way. Our families, our friends, our teachers. The easiest way I can think of showing your appreciation for their investment in your human capital is by shining. And remember, this is not a selfish act. This is the way we give permission to the world to collectively step into the light. Class of 2018, it is your time now. Do me a favor, will you? Take your light and show us the way. God bless you. I love you. Thank you for having me.
So if you look at the next slide, this is a ubiquitous slide. How many people have seen this slide before? You can go ahead and raise your hand even if you hadn't, just to feel good like part of the group. But this slide has been everywhere And really, you can just look at this and say, I've seen this 1,000 times, or you can look at it and see points in our state. Who have we given empowered to step into the light? Who's been denied the light? That's what this is all about. And you can look at these and you can think about economically disadvantaged and about, if you look on one side, you see economic wealth in blue, and you see reading wealth on the right-hand side in blue, and then you can see the various shades of lack of access to literacy on both, or income on both sides, and think about it in terms of economic disadvantage. And there's been a lot of discussion about this around like the word gap, the 30 million word gap. There's been some publicity recently about that study and those terms being offensive because it suggests their study, Hart and Risley, is based on the idea there's a difference in the number of words and quality of words that are shared by adults with their children based on their financial circumstances, contrasting children of poverty and children of affluence on the surface, and suggesting that somehow parents of poverty are less interested somehow in their children's outcomes and share less words or have less capacity. That misses the whole point of that study. And it also misses the point of the research that makes clear universally all parents want the best for their children. The differentiation is around who feels powerful enough to do something about creating that best and who feels powerless to do something about it. And as Julie Washington at Georgia State did research on Hart and Risley in the late 90s after this study was done, it wasn't about who is in poverty and who is in affluence. Our school never talks about poverty. It's who has had access to educational opportunity and who has lacked access to educational opportunity. In the South, more importantly, it's about who's been denied access to educational opportunity for centuries that has left us where we are today. Because when I look at this map as a native Georgian, as someone whose families came from Scotland and Ireland, and as a former American history high school history teacher when Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford were president, when I look at this map, and it's just my view, I'm not telling you I'm right, but when I see this map, all that I see is the tragedy that the people who came here to be free are still free, and the people who were brought here never to be free are still not free because of who's had access to educational opportunity. So for me and for our work at the speech school, moving beyond, and of course the achievement gap, I mean, in my mind there can be nothing worse than using a term like that around, well, he just hasn't quite measured up. And you even get those circumstances where you go to a benefit in a community where people have been cheated for centuries and somebody somehow beats the odds, and one person comes up and speaks about how she broke through the odds, and everybody gives her a standing ovation instead of sitting down and praying, why did we do this to everybody else? And then some social Darwinists think, well, if she could have made it, everybody could have made it, instead of thinking about what do we do to empower every child to have a voice, as Malcolm said. So if we look at the next slide, to move beyond now to the meat of things, Teresa, as you said, really what we're talking about is a science gap and an opportunity gap. And that's why Ms. Deal is right about acting now. That's why Malcolm is right about saying it's fast. It doesn't take a generation. It doesn't take 10 years, or as some suggest, 60 to 100 years to close the achievement gap. Well, first of all, quit talking about the achievement gap. So the real question is, without talking with anybody or calling out, blame him, okay? Blame him for us. We would not be here today. None of us would be in this room. We might be at Lake Sinclair. We might be doing something else. But with this guy, none of us are here. So write down on your piece of paper who you think this guy is. Just write down on your piece of paper somewhere, who is this guy? Good looking guy, right? All right. Come on, take a guess. All right. All right. So who knows this guy? Raise your hand if you know this guy. All right. Man, limited crowd. All right, Ariane, who is this? This is Johannes Gutenberg. He did this. This is his problem. Why has he got us here? The printing press, right? He invented the printing press in 1440. There were 30,000 books in Europe in 1440. By 1500, there were 12 million books in Europe. Do you know who used those books to change the world during the Renaissance? Who happened to live a few blocks away from the Ponte Vecchio in Florence, where all the books were? Who was that? Leonardo da Vinci. Had access to language, and he happened to be able to read, even though he was an illegitimate son. He was the illegitimate son of a lawyer, so he learned how to read. But anyway, the big thing to know about Gutenberg is that when he created the printing press, he demanded our brains suddenly acquire a non-native neurological function in order to thrive. We do not have any circuit in the brain that is constructed for learning how to read. We have our 5 senses. We have a visual and an auditory circuit, but we have no reading circuit. So reading brains aren't developed, they aren't nurtured, they don't emerge, they are constructed. They are absolutely built. And for 530 years, we wandered through the wilderness having no idea how his invention could be a instrument of social justice that would give everybody the opportunity to thrive. Some people read, some people didn't read. Abraham Lincoln read. He had 2 illiterate parents in a wilderness of illiteracy. Why did he read? What was going on there neurologically for Lincoln? Maybe we'll get to that if we have time. But anyway, so we're in this, we were trial and error figuring out how some people could read. More people read now than at any time in human history. We have not gone backward in reading. When we hear that 34% of Georgia's children, 53% who are not on free and reduced lunch can read, 46% of white children in Georgia can read, 34% overall, 21% of African American children, 21% of Hispanic children, and 23% of children on free and reduced lunch can read. So those are the data points. That's the most children who have ever read in our history. We're not doing something different. But now what's happened over the last 30 years, if we go to the next slide, is that we figured out how to construct a reading brain for every single child in our society. The science is absolutely unequivocal about what has to happen and during what window of time this construction has to take place. We do not have an issue of science. We have an issue of access to the science. And right now, the access is based on zip code, race, and ethnicity. It is absolutely, as indisputable as the science is, what we've done to distribute this science in a way that is not about a pursuit of a more perfect union, just the opposite. But this is the brain construction. And we've been very lucky at our school to have access and partnerships with Jack Shonkoff, Walter Gilliam, David Dickinson, Marianne Wolfe, Dina Castro, everybody else. There is no dispute this is the science. The question is, do we have the will to implement it? All right? So if we look at what the stages are for constructing a child's reading brain, just go to the next one. So the first period is preparing the reading brain from the last trimester of pregnancy through age 5. I'm glad you're smiling, Orianne. So even before birth, the reading brain is being constructed during the last trimester of pregnancy. Why the last trimester of pregnancy? What's happened differently in the last trimester? Anybody know? We're going to go fast if nobody knows. What? Brain development. The brain is developed at that point. The auditory channel is complete by then. At that point, the baby can hear mom's voice in the womb. And so if everybody just stands up real quickly, everybody can just stand up real quickly. All right, we are all inside one big baby's brain. We'll be in Teresa's brain, okay, right now. Teresa has just been born. What are we in Teresa's brain right now? What do we represent in her brain? Anybody know? There are 150 billion of us. We are neurons in Teresa's brain. What is wrong with us right now as neurons? Or what's really good about us? What's not going on? We're not connected to each other. What was God thinking about not connecting us starting out life? Because we had to be able to do what? Learn to adapt to our environments, right? And so we're the only unfinished, half-baked organ in the body. And so when we start having experiences, we start making connections with each other. When we make connections, what do we start doing? If we make connections, they're called synapses. And how would you demonstrate the synapses right now? You would grab hands with each other, right? All right, stop, freeze. Freeze, freeze. Those of you who felt so shy about forming hands, guess what happened to you? You can all sit down. Sit if you didn't form hands. If you didn't grab somebody's hand, sit down. Because you just paid the price of being pruned. And you will never come back, and Teresa's lost you forever. And that, yeah, you've done her. All right, thanks everybody. Y'all can sit down. But these synapses start forming in the last trimester as a baby hears sounds from the mom. And in the first 18 months of life, we hear about the word gap, but really a more significant gap, as a significant gap, is the phoneme gap in the first 18 months of life. And we used to think until 5 years ago that phonemes, the 44 sounds of the English language, were something to be taught to kindergartners by a teacher to understand the phonemes of the language. Now, this crazy brain revolution, Patricia Kuhl, University of Washington, has established that these 44 sounds are mapped onto the brain in the first 18 months of life. This most unforgettable person in a child's life, the connection is so powerful that a baby doesn't not only forget the words mom says, she doesn't forget the sounds. And so these sounds, and how do they have to be delivered to the baby? I want you to go to Harvard. So if you're trying to get baby Teresa to Harvard, this is how you talk to little baby, because you want her to really, I want you to go to Harvard, Teresa, okay? Is that going to help her get in Harvard? That's a disaster. She's not going anywhere if that's how you talk to her. That's not how the brain works. How have you got to talk to Teresa to get her into Harvard? You want to go for it?
Yes, let's go to Harvard.
Oh, man, awesome. So what she did is use parentese. And we now know through Kuhl's work, the brain in these 18 months responds to parentese, the high-pitched frequency that has the baby mapping. And does she just say Harvard? Or does she say Harvard? Which one, the first or second? The second, because she elongates the vowel sound so that brain can keep holding and hearing that sound until it maps onto the brain. Now, so this is the heart and Risley problem. And if we're going to really try to make a change, we're going to have some, in my mind, blunt talk, and it's just my point of view. This is where we've done so much harm to some of our children, and where Hart and Risley talks about those being loving words, and words such as stop that, put that down, being negative words. In other words, non-loving words. But the fact is that those words, put that down, stop it, for some of our parents are the most loving, cherished words they're required to use with their children, because they know their children in the South, if they are not compliant or obedient, the risk they face disproportionately to any other child are so great that the dangers of our society have forced parents to use those loving words instead of the words that build the reading brain. It's not a cultural thing. It's not something to respect. It's something that's been inflicted on parents that at one point was a learned behavior that's now just instinct in a dangerous society. You can look at the study of Walter Gilliam on implicit bias against African American boys in preschool that he did 22 months ago, that he released, where he looked to see was there implicit bias against African American boys in preschool. Was the answer yes or no? Yes, they looked at a study of the demographics of children, watched them. Teachers watched children on videos. Preschool-age children engaged in the exact same kind of activity. And white teachers and African-American teachers were asked to look at the children and to see which children they identified is not behaving and engaged in non-compliant behavior. So which teachers disproportionately over-identified African-American boys engaged in non-compliant behavior? The African-American teachers, so desperate to shield their boys, they were so careful to make certain they were safe, they over-identified them as non-compliant, and the damage done. So this first period, and when that happens, not only is language development damaged, but also enormous, irreversible damage to the prefrontal cortex, because executive function in the first 5 years of life, the ability to self-regulate, is dependent upon, as Pat Kuhl also says, from birth to 5, it's essential that children build up a history of making good choices. And those good choices then become the map upon which children can face novel opportunities in the future and can learn to self-regulate and self-identify the behaviors in which they want to engage rather than being dependent on somebody else. So the science around the first 5 years of life, which is preparation of the reading brain, this is the last trimester to age 5 is all about preparation of the reading brain. These are the elements that have to be in place. No matter what quality rated you are or anything else, you can look at a school and determine the neurological development of the children based on whether the children are acquiring language, are they being taught to think critically, are they building executive function, persistence, resilience, and empathy. Is that going on? So I'm going to ask this table to come up front for a quick demonstration. If y'all can come up. Yes, I know, I'm shocking you. Can y'all come up front? We've never met before, right? This isn't a Las Vegas act, but just trying to lighten the mood a little bit here. All right, so quickly, we're going to do this really fast. This is a pre-K classroom. Who wants to be the teacher? Okay, good, great. Thank you, Stephanie. All right, so here's the challenge. We are in the first couple of weeks of school. This pre-K class is in an elementary school, and all of you are third graders, and you're all taking tests to determine whether you're going to be assigned to special education, because this is really a school where a lot of children are struggling, and once you go into special ed in the school, you never come out, by the way. And so this is high stakes around children's futures. Now, if y'all can come over here, that would be great, and we're going to go really fast. But so Stephanie's challenge is that she's got this group of pre-K students, and you're taking tests, and it so happens to be that Teresa and Ariane are the lunch ladies. And they are serving lunch over at that table, but Stephanie has got to get her rowdy pre-K class from here over to the lunch ladies. Lunch ladies, what are y'all having today for lunch? Mac and cheese, all right. So you've got to get your class across here to there, and these guys are taking a test that may be life-defining. What is it that we need? What is it that you need from these kids? You tell them. What do you need from them? You need their silence, right? All right, so now, Stephanie, I want you to get them from here to there and make sure that you're preparing their reading brains while you do it. Okay, all right. So how did she do on empathy? Was there a little bit of empathy there? Okay, how about language? How did she do on language? She spoke. Okay, what about having them think critically? What about executive function? How much did she help them self-regulate? Did she help them build a history of making good choices? Or did she make the choice for them? All right, so I just hate to say it, but I'll just be blunt because we're short on time. And I'll be honest with you, that's a chain gang of 4-year-olds. Abraham Lincoln said that our purpose is to make sure that all children are afforded an unfettered start and a fair chance in the race of life. These are fetters for children, and these are 400-year-old fetters, in fact, because what they do, and this is what will go on thousands and thousands of times for this coming school year in preschools and elementary schools all over Georgia, just continuing a 400-year-old conspiracy of silencing children unwittingly and doing now what we understand to be enormous harm to children's brains. Because here the opportunity is to ask children. So Stephanie, if you think about, if never tell them to be quiet, how can you get them quiet without ever telling them to be quiet? Okay. Does anybody have an idea about how to have them be quiet? They have to be quiet. There's no question about that. How do we get them to be quiet? How do we build vocabulary? How do we build executive function and empathy? How do we do it? Yes, Caitlin. Okay, that's one way. Okay. Sorry. That goes off again. That's one way to do it. What about how is that going to maximize empathy? Let's think about it. All right, so trying to get them quiet. If you can keep asking, you want to ask them questions, okay? Open-ended questions. How can you build their vocabulary? The first thing she started out doing was what? Explaining what? That what they were doing, right? These children are taking a what? A test. Okay, can you build vocabulary now from this? Can you think of a tier 2 word for test? Examination, right? And so when they take an examination, what are they going to have to do? They're going to have to think. You got a tier 2 word for think? They're going to have to concentrate. They're really going to have to concentrate. So you can start off, this is what I would suggest. You can say, and you got to ham it up. You say, boys and girls, I have got a big problem. I've got a dilemma on my hands. We have got to get to lunch, and we're having mac and cheese, but these kids are taking a test, an examination, and they really have to think. You start with the tier 1 word. They really have to think. They really have to concentrate, okay? And you ask these 4-year-olds, how can we help them? And every single group of 4-year-old children is going to say what? They're going to say, be quiet. And then when they go down the hall, how are you going to walk down the hall? Can we see you? Okay, can you go down the hall? Do you have to catch a bubble? Do you need a bubble? No, do you need a bubble? Oh, I love that. Oh, man. That's the kind of bubble I'm talking about. Yeah, so are you doing this? Imagine this. I mean, think about this. We are demanding our children involuntarily blow air into their mouths. You are so incapable of caring about somebody else's life that I have to tell you to be quiet, and then I have to tell you, I still don't trust you enough to do that, so I'm going to tell you to put a finger on your mouth, and I still don't trust you, so I'm going to make you force air into your mouth to do that, and I'm going to make you put your arm on the child in front of you, and you're going to march down the hall. Read Marion Wright Edelman's work on Cradle to Prison Pipeline, and know that at many of our schools, they don't have to worry where to march because the prison architect has already come into the elementary school and drawn the tiles to use just like they do in prison. And that is what you can do, all the letters, numbers, colors, and whatever, but it is the mustard seed on the rocky path of our children in schools where they're being silenced like this. So that is not about brain construction. There's no development of the prefrontal cortex. Neurons are being pruned. And thank you all very much, and Godspeed. You're going to need it. But thank you. So going on, but that's what preschool has to look like to build this foundation. It's about language and all these other functions surrounding the reading brain. The reading brain has to be available to take risks because the day should be filled with open-ended questions. Miss Stephanie should be asking, I wonder what I can do. But if the director of the preschool center has said to Kat on the way in, or Ariane on the way in, now she's not the lunch lady, Ariane, you're late, hurry on back there, okay? Hurry, scoot on back to Miss Stephanie's class. 15 minutes later, Stephanie asked Ariane, how could we help them? She's asking an open-ended, novel question that Ariane has never heard before. What happened to Ariane 15 minutes ago? What were you? Yeah, she was wrong. Was it her fault? And for being wrong, what happened to you? She got humiliated. Now you're asking her a question, an open-ended question. I've been wrong once, and I was publicly embarrassed for it. So when you ask me, how am I going to do it? What's my answer always going to be? I don't know. And the brain develops around asking children questions right at the edge of their proficiency. Not what color their shirt is. If you ask them what color their shirt is, they're going to think they're going to call somebody to get them out of the room because it's not safe to be with an adult who doesn't know her colors. But so if we go on from the preparation of the reading brain, and then you can see what happens kindergarten through third grade to teach and monitor the reading brain around the National Reading Panel's Big Five, around fluency, alphabetic principle, phonemic awareness, vocabulary, and what did I just forget? Comprehension. That happens to teach and monitor. This is where you take the language and executive function and critical thinking skills, birth to 5, and then you map on top of those how you teach children to decode. And then beyond that, if you've done that foundation correctly, the next slide, you'll see then the rest of your life from third grade forward, it's all about expanding the reading brain, where the brain has to acquire 4,000 new vocabulary words a year just to try to be able to compete. So language and reading skills are the two most important things to add. If we had the children in a preschool who were being marched down the hall and we didn't use transition time to push in vocabulary, the difference becomes that when we get to fourth grade, a fourth grade reading book, just see if you can guess this. If you're a child in fourth grade and you've had all the education and foundation you need, and you encounter 100 words on the page of a fourth grade reading book, how many of those 100 words are you supposed to know? You've gotten through third grade, you've gotten all the foundation you need. How many of those vocabulary words are you supposed to know in your fourth grade social book, studies book? There are 100 words. How many of them should you know? All of them? If you know all of them, you're not going to learn any new words, right? Somebody said about 85 or 90. That's exactly right. Why 85 or 90? So why not 100 then? What are we doing right now? We're expanding the reading brain, right? So how are you going to learn those other 10 or 5 to 10 words? In context, right? But if I have had this experience, now if we can go forward now, if we have not had the foundation of the reading brain around language, critical thinking, executive function, resilience, and empathy, when I get to kindergarten through third grade, I've missed that core content. And so when we get to what happens, how many of those 100 vocabulary words do I know if my language has not been built in the first 5 years of life? How many? 40 to 50 of those words. What chance is there for me to learn any new words in context? I am done at that point. And now that's where the massive changes in children being assigned, particularly African American boys, for alleged behavior disorders that don't exist, because as Peggy, are you here? Judge Peggy Walker says, there you are, of course, Peggy. What do you say, Peggy, about if children don't have language? Do you want to tell them?
Behavior becomes their language.
So, so if we keep going from here, so we can go by and you can see how this works. Without this foundation in place, just keep going. And so here is something that's deadly happening in our public schools right now, and in fact in our private schools. Children who have not been prepared with a language foundation and so are coming to school without the necessary abilities to read, guess what crazy dumb thing some of our public school systems are doing? They're training teachers to teach children to read by using the Orton-Gillingham method, and using that as the one method by which to teach children to read. We use the Orton-Gillingham method at our school for children who are dyslexic because we want children to decode. But by hyper-focusing on Orton-Gillingham that teaches children to attach the 44 sounds to the 26 letters without paying attention to backfill this foundation, you will end up like Julie Morell describes, you'll have teachers who are called phonicators. They are all about the phonics, and they do nothing about the underlying language that's here, and you'll get children looking like early readers, and when they get to 4th and 5th grade and they start having to acquire more language and think critically and use their own expressive writing, all of that collapses under this weight of this foundation built out of sand or straw. And so it's all about this, but if this has happened, teachers, kindergarten through 3rd grade, have to learn how to backfill this foundation that was missing. So we can keep going because what time is it? I want to be sensitive to everybody's time. Okay, I'm just about finished. Good. All right, so we can keep going, and then you're stuck. So the way we think about this at the speech school is about reading as an iceberg. That the top of the iceberg is the decoding, phonological processing, and fluency. But you've got to think about what's underneath the iceberg and where those abilities focused on, along with critical thinking and executive function, in the first 5 years of life. Otherwise, again, you may get kids decoding and clip off the top of the iceberg, but when somebody tries to navigate these straits with a bigger ship and not a canoe, they're going to hit these features below that are just below the surface that impact the child. Next slide. So another way of looking at this, you may be familiar with Hollis Scarborough's braid from 2001 that showed reading is about braiding together language abilities and reading skills that are taught kindergarten through 3rd grade. And that is, and Orton-Gillingham, by the way, is one strand of 9 roughly that's about decoding, if you look at that. And again, we're all for Orton-Gillingham, but you've got to have all of these strands in place. And interestingly, Hollis Scarborough thought of, in 2001, phonological awareness as a reading skill to be taught. We now know it's a language ability developed in the first 18 months of life. So what do we do about that? So for our work, our Cox campus is all about building an ecosystem around a child with parent, teacher, and child in the middle, providing them with the resources necessary for this brain construction to start as early as in the OBGYN office, where parents are being coached on how to become their baby's conversational partner, providing language nutrition to their baby, carrying all the way through prenatal care providers, pediatric, community health, infant toddler educators, all the way through kindergarten through 3rd grade teachers. If you see the next slide, these are all the courses on our Cox campus that are built to create that ecosystem. How much do they cost? They're free. The Cox Foundation and the Woodruff Foundation have been very generous. There are 37,000 teachers in 42 countries, all 50 states, who are training on this campus right now. Our kindergarten through 3rd grade courses will be available in July. We've been very fortunate to work with Teresa and with Caitlin to develop these courses. We're looking for every opportunity schools that would commit next year to being part of this effort to fundamentally change, to use Malcolm's words, transform kindergarten through 3rd grade education around what do we do to concurrently backfill the reading brain in preparation while instructing and monitoring the reading brain. So to end, I'll go back to what I heard Ms. Deal say. I asked her one time, and I said, Ms. Deal, you're focused on literacy. How long does it take you when you come into a preschool or elementary school to know whether it's a school that is building reading brains? And she said, less than a minute. And I was sort of startled, and I said, well, what do you mean by that? And she said, well, if the teacher principal or librarian is telling the children with whom I'm trying to connect to be quiet, then I know it's not happening. And so here is the Chinese symbol that we use at our school and all the schools with whom we work, where no one's ever told to be quiet, because the behavior we're asking for from children is the ability to listen. And the Chinese symbol represents it perfectly. There are 4 things that have to be open: ears, eyes, and most importantly, mind and heart. And we want our children to open ourselves up to each other with deepest respect, not to be quiet, and not to wait our turn. And you'll see that nowhere on here is there a need to show anybody with a closed mouth. That is the outcome of this deep respect and connection with other people. So, I guess my dream is, with 6 months left in office, and if you think back to the history of Georgia, I'll leave you with this, that in the 1700s, do you think there were many slave owners who taught their slave children to read? Who thinks there were some slave owners who taught their slave children to read in the 1700s? Anybody think so? Who thinks they didn't teach them to read? If you didn't vote, I'm going to make you vote again, all right? Because we're not going to get out of here till everybody votes. So who believes that there were a number of slave owners in the 1700s who taught their slave children to read? Who thinks there weren't many slave owners who did that? The answer is there were a number of slave owners who taught their slave children to read because they wanted them to read what? The Bible. Which testament? New or old? The New. They wanted to read about Paul, and they wanted to read about Paul's deferred redemption by being obedient to one's master. And so everything changed in 1822 when a freedman preacher got up in a pulpit and preached not from Paul, but from, which one? Say it loud. Come on, own it. Moses from Exodus, and said at the burning bush, he quoted God saying to Moses, true redemption comes from liberating those who are forced into obedience by someone other than me. And this preacher got up and preached that sermon. He was hanged along with 35 other followers. The church burned to the ground. The name of the church in Charleston, South Carolina, Mother Emanuel Church. The church where Dylan Roof killed 9 parishioners 2 years ago because he knew the danger of a voice about liberation from that church and its history. So after that, state legislatures, and the state capitol in 1829 was where in Georgia? Milledgeville, 2 blocks away, and the Georgia legislature passed a law saying what? You can no longer teach African American children to read, and if you're an African American doing it to your children, you'll be beaten and incarcerated for it. So what an amazing thing to be in this town where Georgia silenced its children, to be in a place at the Sandra Dunnigan Deal Center a couple of blocks away all these years later, where our leading representatives, our leaders, our servants are imploring all of us finally to give all our children a voice. Thank you.